Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. Our esteemed guests from academia, industry, military, and government backgrounds offer unique insights and analysis that you won't find anywhere else. Christopher Ankersen, Gordon McBean, and Jean Slick join us this week to discuss the ongoing wildfires across Canada, Canada's emergency response capacity, climate security, and the role of the CAP in addressing domestic disaster response, as well as the feasibility of developing a civilian natural disaster response unit. This is the Expert Series. Hi, Dr. Ankersen. Good to see you again. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program. In light of the increasing frequency and severity of domestic natural disasters, do you agree with Richard Fadden that relying solely on the military for disaster response is outdated? And what alternative options should prime ministers or the government have at their disposal?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And certainly I think recent events have only kind of brought to the fore something that's been around for a while and people have been commenting on for a number of years. And I would say, though, that the natural disasters or disasters of environmental nature are not only increasing in terms of frequency and intensity, but also in terms of scale, in terms of scope, in terms of their simultaneity, and even their duration. So this is an actual step change, I think, in what we're starting to see now will probably, if things continue, become worse to the point where it's no longer going to, talking about a once in a decade or once in a century flood or whatever it might be, is going to start to become problematic in that the new normal has the potential to become overwhelming. The second thing I would say is, to be fair, the Canadian Armed Forces is not the only domestic response capability we have. There's a lot of work that goes on at the municipal, indigenous, First Nations, provincial, as well as federal levels that doesn't include the Canadian Armed Forces. It tends to become newsworthy when the Canadian Armed Forces are involved, but we see a number of civil society organizations, things like Team Rubicon. We see some hybrid solutions now, like the Red Cross, for example, as a civil society organization, but in some ways contracted by the various provincial and federal governments out there to provide these services. The use of overseas assets, bringing in firefighters, for example, from South Africa or Australia or the United States. So there are. And I don't think it's worth painting a picture that it's only like it's nothing or the Army. That's certainly not the case. That being said, I do agree to a large extent with what Fadden's talking about, where there is a feeling now that the military is a solution that is perhaps originally thought of as the solution of last resort, but in many cases now it is going to be looks like it's going to be the solution of inevitability, right? That we're going to do all these other things, but then eventually the Canadian Armed Forces will have to get involved because of the scale, intensity, et cetera, that's going on. So whereas the Canadian Armed Forces used to view this as a be prepared to task that they might have to do once every, again, decade, quarter century, 3 years, whatever it might be, this is becoming much more of a regular task, a standing task. We've seen some acknowledgement of that by the Canadian Armed Forces, this notion of a standing operation, Operation Lentis, where domestic operations now are conceived of as something that is going to be happening kind of constantly, whether it's floods, fires, support to other aspects of civil governance. And therefore, the real question becomes, what do you do about that, right? Do you continue to see this as a be prepared to task? Just do a minimum amount of preparation, have some liaison officers, do some coordination with domestic operations planning at the provincial level, but more or less wait to be called? Or should the Canadian Armed Forces lean into this and really take this as let's call it more of a core mission, where it's not training for combat operations, and then if it has to, it drops its rifles, picks up a shovel, and goes and does this? Or does it actually see it as potentially another pillar or a co-equal activity, and therefore start to really dedicate precious time, resources, training, planning bandwidth to actually kind of be ready for these on a much more proactive basis. What complicates this in the Canadian landscape, and I think regular Canadians look out and say, well, why don't we, why doesn't FEMA respond or something like that, is we have a very different setup for the notion of, let's call them environmental emergencies here in Canada. And as I said, we have a plethora of other actors. Municipalities, if we look at Halifax, for example, the municipal fire department, the mayor of Halifax is very much involved in trying to worry about, wildfires. The provinces have an enormous role. The federal government does not have an enormous role. It has a role, but it's actually not that big. And we can add into that kind of array, as I said, First Nations, indigenous governmentalities out there kind of trying to deal with this. You throw in things like Team Rubicon, others, private sector actors. A lot of the, for example, forest firefighting aircraft are owned by private entities that are then contracted out by provinces. And that somewhat kind of complicates the environment. So to say, what does a prime minister have at his disposal, his or her disposal, starts to really kind of beg the question, what role does the federal government have in the first place? It's a bit of a history lesson to go back and look at the British North America Act, kind of the founding constitutional framework of this country. The natural resources of the country are really allocated to the provinces for the exploitation, right? And therefore, through some accident of geography, if you happen to have a place where lots of dinosaurs used to live, you get oil. If you have a place there used to be lots of carboniferous ferns, you have coal. These were not kind of designed that way. Lines were drawn up on a map, a couple hundred years ago, and it turns out now those resources belong first and foremost to the provinces. The kind of flip side of that is the provinces are therefore responsible for maintaining stewardship of those. So let's take a forest, for example. You get to gain money from chopping those trees down. You get to take a royalty or stumpage fee, whatever it might be. So there, the flip side of that is you're also responsible for regulating, maintaining all of that, including if that forest goes on fire, you are responsible for putting it out. So the primary responsibility for these kinds of natural environmental issues, a landslide, a forest fire, all of those kinds of things, resides firmly with the province. That means the federal government's role is there to support, to augment, to coordinate, but none of those actually have a prima facie, hey, get out of the way, this is our responsibility. That's very different setup to what we see in the United States. United States, FEMA, if you declare a federal emergency, for example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency comes in and kind of takes over and then coordinates and kind of takes the lead on coordination of a fire in, let's say, Oklahoma. That never happens in Canada. When the federal government becomes involved, it is very much in support to the provinces who retain jurisdiction, who retain the lead. So I think we need to be very clear about that whatever the federal government does is going to intimately be involved with, right now, at least 13 other actors, right? At least the premiers of all the provinces and the leaders of the territories, at the very least. It's not something that the federal government is going to take over. It just doesn't work that way in Canada. That being said, there is a role, again, to support in extremis. And I think what we're really talking about is what should that look like? Does that then become the Canadian Armed Forces? And that's a good question as to say, why would it be the Canadian Armed Forces? Why not the RCMP? Why not the Coast Guard? Why not, the Federal Ministry of Fisheries? There are other options out there, but the reality is, over years of efficiencies and a change to a more neoliberal model, if you want to talk about who's got people in the federal government that are available, that is to say, there are actual bodies available, add to that how many of those bodies are trained, fit, equipped, know how to use a radio, have some aspect of chain of command where somebody can kind of coordinate their movements. They have their own logistical resources like boats, planes, trucks, And you're really limiting this down to the Canadian Armed Forces. There's another aspect, which is to say that the safety and security of Canadians is also a task that falls naturally to the military. And again, this is this civil military relationship. I wouldn't say it's unique in Canada, but it's not the same everywhere around the world. So if you go to Indonesia, for example, or the Philippines, and say the military should be the last resort, they would look at you very strangely and say, no, the military is the first resort. When a typhoon hits or a cyclone hits, we would expect the military to be the first responders, not wait till everyone else has had their chance and then bring in the military. The military would be the first responder. So we have to be aware of the fact that as Canadians, some of the options that other countries use, there's no reason why we couldn't do them, but that would take some legislative, some bureaucratic heavy lifting to be able to make that happen. In the United States, for example, state governors have command over, legal authority over their National Guard, their state National Guard, who have a key role in domestic operations. So the governor of Oklahoma, if a tornado goes through, doesn't have to ask or wait. He or she can activate their state National Guard and deploy them to do those kinds of tasks. That is not a be prepared to task. That is one of the main tasks that National Guard has, and therefore it's used to having to deal with that. And you can argue then, why are you spending so much time on, I don't know, machine gun drills or air to ground, combat air support? You really need to be focusing on domestic operations in that context. Canadian Armed Forces doesn't work that way. The premiers have a link to the Canadian Armed Forces through various legislation, through the National Defense Act and other things, but they do not have all of the soldiers that happen to be resident in Alberta or Saskatchewan do not have a chain of command, dotted line or otherwise, to the premier of that province. So we do need to kind of look at this in the Canadian context rather than saying, why can't it look like the way it looks in another country? So I think that's a very long answer to your question before we actually start to answer that question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ankersen. That was a very comprehensive and insightful response. Since you've essentially answered all the questions I had for you, I will give you the opportunity to provide any final thoughts or insights you have, whether they be about the role of the CAF in addressing natural disasters, the response to the crisis so far, or if you'd like to comment on cooperation between different organizations, the provinces, and the feds.
Sure. So I have 2 points I would like to make. The first one is a two-parter. One is my preference, if somebody asks my opinion, is that there should be a civilian-led response mechanism. That we don't necessarily rely on the military to do these kinds of tasks. Now, clearly today in extremis, in the absence of that kind of a thing, whatever it might look like, whether it's a semi-volunteer type arrangement, whether it's a contracted arrangement, whether we create a new department or division within a department to take that role, the Federal Emergencies Organization or something like that in Canada, that would be my preference. However, that would take extra money. It's going to be bureaucratic. It's got to be carved out. It's got to be recruited. It's got to be stood up. It's got to be trained. That's going to take a number of years. I'm not sure that there's an appetite to do that. Again, we used to have a thing called Emergency Management Canada. In the old days, it largely was a federal responsibility because it was hooked to the notion of defense. And it looked at, for example, post-nuclear war response, which was clearly a defense mechanism, which was clearly, therefore, in the British North America Act, a federal responsibility. Again, we're going to run into this federal organization, if we were to create it, is going to run into this friction between the provinces, which, let's be fair, right now, federal-provincial relations are not at an all-time high. So it's going to be difficult, I think, to do that. But it's still my preference to have some kind of civilian-type arrangement. I think the provinces should have to pay for that or contribute to that, again, on the notion that they're the ones that benefit from the resources in their jurisdiction. Therefore, they should pay for the upkeep and the response to that in some mechanism. How easy is that to negotiate? Not great at this moment, right? So the second part of that is, therefore, the Canadian Armed Forces are going to be stuck with this in the near to medium term at the very least. And therefore, I don't think it's very healthy for the Canadian Armed Forces to say, we don't want to do this. General Eyre has been very clear that we would rather not the Canadian Armed Forces would rather not get involved in these kinds of things, as they see it as a distraction from their main job, which they believe is national defense and power projection, foreign policy type Canadian Armed Forces issues. And therefore, they would prefer not to do this. And I think you have to avoid the impression that they're kind of sitting there with their arms crossed saying, we don't want to do this, so we're going to do the minimum a minimum necessary to prepare. I think the Canadian Armed Forces is stuck with this task for a while, and the task is going to get bigger. It's not a once in a decade type thing. It's every year, every summer, there are going to be soldiers and aviators and sailors responding to forest fires. That's not going to change. So therefore, should they spend time equipping, training, and leaning more into just doing the bare minimum? My sad conclusion is yes, they need to do that. They need to embrace this. Yes, we would like to have something different, but that ain't going to happen anytime soon. And therefore, things like in anticipation of forest fire season, actually do the minimum training required to get your standby forces ready to go, so that we don't have to say, hey, the forest's on fire, can you help? No, now we need to take 48 hours in order to get our ducks in a row. I think the reality is, come April, come May, those standby forces that the Canadian Armed Forces does designate in every region around the country need to be ready to go on a certain level of notice, because that's just the reality. That last resort piece is getting closer and closer to first responder as we go through this, as the scale, scope, frequency, duration, intensity, and simultaneity of these things goes on. So that's the first thing I would say. I would like to have a civilian agency do it, but in the absence of that, the Canadian Armed Forces need to get better at doing this and prepare. The second thing I would say is, again, this is a real issue that needs to be negotiated between all of the actors present. And to sit there and pretend that we can just snap our fingers and make a federal response that doesn't take into consideration either the needs, wants, and desires of the various actors, including foremost the provinces. But at the same time, the provinces have to be able to be seen to be paying for this in some way, either through increase in taxes or some kind of transfer mechanism to fund this, because otherwise we're talking about moral hazard, where the provinces are taking more risky decisions in terms of zoning permission to develop suburbs in places where there's traditionally been fires or flooding, and therefore saying, hey, we don't have to worry about it because we'll just snap our fingers and the feds will come and sort it out, either through this yet to be made federal response mechanism or the Canadian Armed Forces. There does exist a mechanism to charge back for Canadian Armed Forces deployments to these kinds of things. It does not happen by it. Whether we're talking about floods, fires, etc., the Department of National Defense pays for these kinds of deployments out of its budget. And therefore, I think this is where General Eyre's issue is. It's not just a preference, hey, I don't like doing these kinds of things. What he's really saying is, I have to pay for these things out of my existing budget, which I'm also competing with to upgrade anti-submarine warfare or get new air defense systems. It's all one pot of money. It's not growing, and yet I'm constantly being told to do more with the same or more with less as time goes on. So I think that issue needs to be sorted out more critically, more importantly, more urgently than, can we create somebody else to do this? As much as it pains me to have this, I would very much I don't like the idea of militarizing these kinds of tasks. I don't think it's a good idea, ethically, politically, for a whole bunch of reasons. But that being said, there needs to be a real leaning forward on the part of the Canadian Armed Forces, and there needs to be a commitment to fund those kinds of things and augment those kinds of defense funds, so they're not actually paying for this out of their already insufficient budget.
Dr. Ankersen, it's been a pleasure as always. Thanks for joining me today. Jean, it's nice to have you on the program. Thanks for joining us today. I'll start off with the question you suggested, which is, what can be done to address response personnel shortages when there are multiple disasters?
Sure. Well, I think we do need to prepare to ensure we have response capacity when there are multiple simultaneous disasters and or different kinds of events occurring at the same time. You could theoretically have fires and floods, for example, that you're responding to. And I think what we need to really do is ensure that we've got surge capacity. And the standard practice for doing that is, when you have your own capacities, and when those are limited, then you draw from other resources. So first, it's really about that whole thing about mutual aid agreements, drawing from other jurisdictions within a province, and then cross-province. There will be times when in Canada, we don't have sufficient resources, and we see that during fire season, and needing to draw on others. So it's really around what's the pre-planning that's been done to enable those mutual aid supports to come into play when they're needed. And mutual aid supports could be personnel, but it could also be other physical assets that are needed in an operation. So it's really about how do we scale up and ensure that interoperability when we bring people in from different jurisdictions. So that requires that we have systems that are interoperable as well. So that's sort of the basic foundation about how we do it. There will be times, however, and if we think to the pandemic as an example, when everybody's dealing with the same thing at the same time, in which case you've got to use the assets that you have in your local jurisdiction. And that requires you to then triage around what you're going to do with those resources and to prioritize. So that's the basic schema that we're operating from. And that will be true, regardless of the types of events that we're dealing with.
Is a national response agency similar to FEMA a viable option for Canada?
The idea of having a FEMA has been promoted and discussed as an option. And I think there's challenges. One of the things I actually say to students is, I doubt that we would ever have a FEMA type organization in Canada. And it really goes back to the British North America Act when Canada was founded, which is now referred to as the Constitution Act, and the real founding of distribution of responsibilities in Canada. So whatever additional supports are created and structures are created, we still have to work within the given governance structure in Canada. And so the federal government has certain powers related to emergency management, health, education. So it's not just limited to emergency management. We see it in other sectors in society. And provinces and territories have primary responsibility for the delivery of those services within their respective jurisdictions. So my concern is that if we were to have a Canadian Emergency Management Agency, is that its functions, if it's a federal agency, are going to be limited. That being said, if we look back to what happened after the first SARS incident, that led to the creation of the Public Health Agency in Canada. But the Public Health Agency in Canada has very specific and mandated roles. So theoretically, yes, we could have a Canadian Emergency Management Agency, but it's not going to have the same scope and it's not going to have the same functions that a FEMA would. So I think the analogy to FEMA is not necessarily appropriate. It might be better to say something like the Public Health Agency of Canada, or look to other countries that have similarities. So I would say, let's look at Australia as an example, which also has significant fires and which also has, some similarities in terms of governance. There's still some difference in terms of how the society is constituted. But that's really the foundational reason. So FEMA works in the US because of the roles of the federal government in the states, but those roles are different here. So what we need is an enhanced system in Canada to provide those supports when they're needed cross jurisdiction. But the challenge is our governance system is really focused on people essentially functioning in their own backyards.
How effective has the current emergency management strategy been in mitigating the impact of the ongoing Canadian wildfires? And to what extent would you say the EM strategy addresses the increasing frequency and severity of wildfires or other climate-related disasters in Canada?
Well, the EM strategy, it has 5 priorities, and it's an aspirational document. And the goals, it sets out a number of goals in relation to each of these priorities. And I reviewed them again before this interview, just to go back and take a look in relation to your 2 questions. I think one of the things that I would say, they're describing goals and they're aspirational. There's not a lot of concrete direction in there, so they're broad goals. But the other key thing is that those goals are framed in relation to what federal, provincial, and territorial authorities are going to do, again, within their own jurisdiction. There's very limited wording in there in terms of pan-Canadian activities that would take place. So we have seen some things. So there's more work being done at a national level around identifying capabilities in terms of identifying risks. So we have some of those activities occurring, but they only occur when you've got this mutual agreement of federal, provincial, and territorial ministers.
In light of recruitment challenges and strains on the military, what steps can be taken to address personnel shortages and ensure that the armed forces can effectively fulfill their various roles, including disaster relief, without compromising their overall operational readiness?
So I think that the military has a unique set of assets that are available. And in particular, they have an exceptional logistics capacity. And so they do have personnel. So sometimes those personnel will be available and sometimes they will not be. And there are times when we have events, we will draw on people who do not normally respond. And that is a situation when we draw the military in. Now, we do have a Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre. It's a not-for-profit organization, but funded and essentially managed by the provinces. And so that wildfire center looks at the resources that are available and monitors all of what's going on and assists with that interagency deployment. What I'm not sure about is the degree to which the pre-planning for when military would be included in deployment is built into the already existing system. So what we want to do is be clear around at what point would we draw in the military and at what point would we draw in other resources. So the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre already has the relationship with the US as well as other countries to draw in other assets. So the question is, when do we draw on assets from outside of Canada versus other assets from within Canada? I can imagine that if there was a real critical time shortage where we might be able to deploy a resource from within Canada sooner than from overseas, and it was really critical in terms of protection of life safety, we might choose to do that. So I think the military will always be an asset. Should we be fully dependent on it? No. So, we look at British Columbia that more recently has set up a year-round wildfire service as an example of a model that we might look at.
With your background in the Canadian Red Cross and experience in disaster response and recovery, how do you assess the coordination and collaboration between different stakeholders, including government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and communities in the ongoing Canadian wildfires? Are there any opportunities for improvement or lessons learned from past experiences?
Sure. I think the first thing is to be able to understand risks and anticipate risks and be ready. And certainly we know that being able to scale up operations at the appropriate time. So generally there's a historic time when we scale up for wildfire operations, but we know that changes from year to year. So it's about really having that kind of capability. I think assets like the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre are excellent in terms of the kind of work they do, but it's a not-for-profit organization funded by the government. So is that something that, needs to be enhanced? The other thing is that response, and there's been some very good work being started. We're a bit late to the game on it in terms of doing training with indigenous communities in terms of enhancing their own capability. So it's really, where can we strengthen that response capacity? And I think there are areas we can do that. So overall, I would say there's a good system in place in terms, framework and system for that interagency sharing and coordination. The challenge is we still have different systems operating within each province, right? And so any assets that are integrated have to integrate into these different systems. So there's certainly work that can be done. And I think that sort of more shared goal around common operating systems becomes really critical.
Well, Jean, I appreciate you taking some time to speak with me today. As we close out this discussion, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts or if you think there's any important points you'd like to touch on that we haven't yet.
Well, I think our experiences with wildfire in Canada parallel what we see going on in the US, Australia, and other countries in the world. We know that there's, increasing severity over time. We also know that we need to give more attention to this wildland urban interface. It's not a unique Canadian issue. So there's plenty of issues for us to work on. I think it's really about the will and the capacity to address the things that we know we need to do.
Jean, thank you so much for joining us today. Nice to meet you, Gordon, and thanks for joining us today for the Expert Series. To what extent can the ongoing Canadian wildfires be attributed to climate change? How does the severity of these wildfires reflect broader climate change trends in the region?
Well, wildfires are a result of usually warmer situations, drier situations, and other things that cause the fires themselves. And I think what we're seeing with climate change is certainly in the areas where the fires are, there has been much warmer temperatures, which also reduces the relative humidity so that things are relatively drier. And so they are more prone to. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change latest assessment report said that climate change is showing increasing role in wildfires on its international assessment. This wasn't particularly in the Canadian ones, but it was the global assessment is that climate change is making a difference. And it also has implications for our greenhouse gas emissions, since the burning of fires gives off methane gas, which is a very potent, there's not as much of it in the atmosphere, but nonetheless, it's molecule per molecule, it's more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of causing greenhouse effects.
As Canada experiences its worst wildfire season in history, what challenges and limitations do you foresee in establishing a national disaster response agency that could effectively address the increasing severity and frequency of these climate-related disasters across the country?
Well, I think this is going to be a challenge based on my experience and things that we have a situation in Canada where the responsibility for natural resources, apparently under the Constitution, says that's the responsibility of the provinces. And so that you get into issues of fires and floods, those things become really an issue as to who and how. We also need to recognize that these things are not only across Canada, but they're international connections as well. I mean, we talk about river flooding. Well, rivers flow from one province to another, but they also flow from one country to another. And so we need to have a more integrated approach to this. If I can quote the person I always like to quote at this point, the Secretary General of the United Nations said very recently, if I had to select one sentence to describe the state of the world, I would say we're in a world in which global challenges are more and more integrated, and the responses are more and more fragmented. And if this is not reversed, it's a recipe for disaster. So there's a very strong need to start addressing these issues in a more unified way, bringing together the resources, the expertise, the capacity at different levels of government and across communities, helping one community and individuals to address the issues of climate change and the need to both do adaptation, which is basically reducing our exposure and vulnerability to the climate extreme events, which are happening more frequently, and mitigation, which is reducing emissions. And we need to take strategies that address both together in a more integrated way. And this requires multi-level governance participation more actively than we, quite frankly, traditionally see in this situation.
Given the strain on the CAF and the need to deploy soldiers for disaster assistance, from your perspective, how could some kind of national disaster response agency collaborate effectively with the military to optimize resources and ensure a coordinated response during a time of crisis?
Well, as I was saying, I think this is an area where we need to have interdepartmental committees at various government levels. As you are aware, I was the Assistant Deputy Minister of the atmospheric part of Environment Canada, so I was responsible for, when I was the ADM, for all the weather forecasts, but not responsible for the flood forecasts. But I also was working with the military in the weather forecasts at military bases and operations and in the near coastal zones for marine forecasts and sea ice forecasts, so that we could have a more integrated approach. And it was very positive in the times I had meetings with some of the generals, the Deputy Chief of Defense Staff, I remember more than once, in which we discussed this issue and how we could bring it together. And I think that kind of approach needs to be developed further across other government departments and agencies, so that we can have, say, experienced people who know and understand the issues, and quite frankly, staying in their jobs longer than seems to be traditional now, to undertake these strategic actions together.
Well, Gordon, I'm wondering if you can build off this a little bit. Would you be able to share any specific examples or insights from your time as ADM for the atmospheric component of Environment Canada, where you witnessed the impact of climate change on disaster management and response efforts?
Yes, well, particularly one area has been the adaptation side, which needs to bring in these kind of things across various levels of government. And we've seen, both in my time when I was ADM and in my academic 20 years since, in which we've looked at situations where some provinces have done very well and effectively, others have not. I'm working on a report right now which quotes the Canadian assessment, the federal government's report, which basically says in Ontario, where I live, is very much behind progress in climate change adaptation. And they also, when I was ADM, well, to Canada with the full support of the province, is to put out what we called integrated environmental predictions, in which we would say, for Monday to Friday forecast, that Monday and Tuesday are going to be particularly nice days. Thursday and Friday, they're going to be very hot, and that will lead to higher levels of air pollution. And with that, we would put out a health message. So our advice was, do your outside activities where possible on Thursday, Monday, Tuesday, but not Thursday, Friday, so you can stay out of those hot, air pollution, high heat days. When we discussed doing that with the province of Ontario, my counterpart, at the working level, we agreed this was worth discussing. And then he reported back to me that the minister said, under no circumstances are we going to allow the federal government to put out a forecast on air pollution, because that's a natural resource, that's a provincial responsibility. So don't do it. Now, we won't go into the details of that one, but just to say that we need to have this kind of cooperation. And it's also important, I think, to bring in the academic side to these issues. I started doing things by, let's say, putting in groups of scientists of my federal responsibility. I had a large team of scientists working in my team, and we put some of them on university campuses as research groups, so that we could have a combination of the academic research teams with the federally groups of scientists, not isolated from the rest of their organizations, but fully, let's try to integrate and work together. Because the reality is that so many of the issues we're dealing with now are what we might call multidisciplinary, that we need to have social scientists, natural scientists, economists, lawyers in physics people, engineers who deal with building structures, need to be working together to integrated solutions to these things. And that's been a term issue that, in my experience, is still continuing.
Based on your experience, Gordon, I'm wondering if you could share any potential policy recommendations you would suggest to enhance Canada's disaster management framework.
Well, let me just first of all say that most people, when we talk about these in policy and an international basis, are very much aware of the Paris Climate Agreement. But one agreement that we also, Canada, signed and ratified is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was agreed to. When I was, quite frankly, part of the negotiating team in Sendai, Japan, as leading of the science and technology major group. And so we negotiated these things, and we came up with not a long list of, like the Sustainable Development Goals have, I think it's 16 or 17 targets and 69 objectives. Anyway, it's very large. Anyway, the Sendai Framework, and I've got it in front of me, talks about 4 priority areas. One is understanding the risk, really delve into it from a multidisciplinary point of view. The second one is strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. Thirdly, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. And fourthly, for better preparedness for effective response and to build back better when we come out, have a disaster. Let's not rebuild it the way it was. Let's build it better. But just to go into that question of governance, there is an international agreement. We need to have better approaches to disaster risk governance. And I think in Canada, that would mean trying to bring together, at least initially, various departments, agencies, certainly at the federal, provincial, and at least in a representative way, municipalities, to at least to discuss how we might come up with what you talk about as Canada's disaster management framework, in a way that we can actually have something that we think can work. At least we got to have people talking about it in a more pragmatic way. And as we're seeing with the wildfires now, the Canadian military is responding by having, working out there and to be in various locations to help fight the fires. And I was just going to say, and they have the experience of working together as teams. As I think I said to you, that I actually was an artillery officer cadet when I was a university student, and one of my first experiences that I will always remember is fighting a fire that was taking place at Camp Shiloh, Manitoba. When we were there, we were out on day maneuvers to practice our military things, and then this fire broke out because of an artillery cannon that had gone to the wrong place or something. I'm not remembering exactly how, but anyway, we spent 2 or 3 days in active process of fighting to put out this fire. And it was let's say, a considerably valuable learning experience to work as a team and go through that. And I think experience is what we need to bring together across these issues from various departments, agencies, levels of government. I do think we need to make sure that, first of all, that we deal with these in an integrated way, that we deal with adaptation and emission reductions in a way that complements one another and not react. And that needs, again, to bring together the departments and agencies and people. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is to motivate in, let's say, communities and householders and people so that they understand the problem and they are willing and interested in taking action. And I just say that in the IPCC report, the North American chapter, which was written by Canadian and American, and others, said that addressing these risks has been made more urgent by delays due to misinformation about climate science that has sowed uncertainty and impeded the recognition of risk. So I think that the communities need to stand up and say, the climate science on this is very much has been strengthened over the years, and it is very important in terms of its assessment that's saying things are happening. It is unequivocal that the climate is changing due to human activities now. And as I said, with the wildfires and other things, there is more evidence of that. So I think if various groups can join in this in a way of helping to communicate, and with that communication of the scientific evidence, to how can we also communicate the actions that people can take in a way they understand. One of the things that with our weather forecasts we start doing was trying not only just to say it's going to be raining, but let's not say it's not only going to be raining, it's going to be raining and have these kind of implications for you. And that needs to be tailored in a sense, or let's say put out in a way that makes sense to individuals and communities that are the ones being impacted, so they get responses. Because often we've seen recently in the last decade major floods where there was warnings issued, but many people didn't hear them. And if they did hear them, they either ignored them or they didn't know what they really meant for them to do. Just sort of hoped it would go away, this flooding or whatever. But we need to worry about the mental and physical and economic impacts, because although we count up dollars in terms of the impacts for insurance, health effects on people can be very, very significant in ways that have long-term implications. And for that reason, we need to have action so that we don't have these kind of impacts anymore.
Gordon, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hope to continue this conversation with you in the future. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or you can subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.